This episode is dedicated to the memory of Dustin Schillinger. "23-year-old Randy Church was a kind, caring, and hardworking young man attending Montana State University in the city of Bozeman. A native of Montana, Randy had come to school seeking a degree in electrical engineering, one of his true passions. In order to put some cash together, he'd picked up a job at the local Pizza Hut, where he quickly worked his way up the chain and obtained the position of shift supervisor. He enjoyed his work and was dedicated to it, known to fellow employees as one of the most reliable and hardest-working supervisors they had. One cold and snowy weekend in February of 1985, Randy had agreed to cover the closing shift of another employee who needed the weekend off. After locking up at midnight, Randy stayed behind to deep clean the store and prep for the next morning's business. He allowed other employees to go, staying by himself in the restaurant. Sometime that night, by means no one has yet determined, one or more persons entered the business and held Randy at gunpoint. After forcing him to hand over all of the available cash, the assailant needlessly raised the gun and fired 2 shots, killing the 23-year-old instantly. For nearly 40 years, Randy's brutal murder has remained the sole unsolved homicide on the books in the city of Bozeman. Despite a diligent investigation, no suspect has ever been officially named and no charges have ever been filed. While some believe Randy was the victim of a random crime, a robbery gone wrong, others theorize that he may have been targeted by someone he knew and thought he could trust. Tragically, Randy himself may have opened the door and welcomed his killer inside, never imagining what would happen next. This is Trace Evidence, episode 242, The Murder of Randy Church. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. In today's episode, we examine the mysterious and senseless murder of 23-year-old Randy Church, a smart, dedicated, and hardworking Montana State University student whose life was cut short during an apparent late-night robbery. This is the murder of Randy Church. It was a cold and snowy night in Bozeman, the 4th most populous city in the Big Sky country of Montana. Strong winds swept in from the west and stirred up thick drafts of snow and precipitation, making the night difficult to traverse and hard to see through. For 23-year-old Randy Church, it was just another night where he'd find himself working the closing shift at the local Pizza Hut. A student at nearby Montana State University, Randy was a fun-loving, kind, and friendly guy who almost everyone enjoyed being around. No one could have ever imagined that a cruel and calculating killer would cut his life short, robbing him of his dreams and his family of their beloved son and brother. Randall Roy Church was born on Thursday, September 28, 1961, in Havre, Hill County, Montana, to parents Richard and Darlene. Randall was the couple's 4th child and would be the 2nd youngest when they rounded out the family with the birth of their 5th. Richard had married Darlene, a Havre native, in 1955 and supported the family while working as a machinist with the Great Northern Railway, which carried many jobs to Havre and smaller cities located along the east to west corridor of U.S. Highway 2. Richard worked a tough job based out of a train repair and fueling station located not far from the family home. Though he enjoyed his work, the hours could be grueling, as for much of his career, he would work the 2 to 11 p.m. shift. Darlene split her time, dedicating much of it to raising the children and maintaining the home, but she worked several jobs in the food service industry, normally in the kitchen. According to the Montana Review, she was the head cook of a highly popular breakfast restaurant, the Pancake House. Randall, or Randy as almost everyone in his life referred to him, was very close to his mother and often accompanied her to work, as well as on visits to the train depot where they would deliver home-cooked dinner to Richard on his lunch breaks. According to friends and family, from a young age, Randy was always a kind, fun-loving, and caring person who had a close connection with his family. His brother Rick explained, quote, "Randy was the most sensitive of the siblings. He was the person who kept the family connected and who could relate to everyone in the family. Dad was a hard guy, and Randy would communicate and connect with everyone, including our father." End quote. Smart, sensitive, and determined, Randy loved being together with his siblings and parents, as well as out having fun with a large circle of friends that was always expanding. According to the Montana Review, Randy loved spending time running around outside, riding bikes, and playing hide and seek, but an asthma diagnosis would require him to curtail some of that activity. Due in part to spending a little more time inside, Randy developed a keen interest in electronics and computers, learning about circuitry and soldering. His interests were not limited only to home-based systems, though, as he also developed a love for engines and muscle cars. Randy was described by many people in his life as creative, self-motivated, and industrious. He wasn't the type to wait for things to happen. He was more focused on doing what he could to achieve his own goals. When he was younger and didn't have access to money outside of an allowance, he disregarded the idea of store-bought gifts and instead devoted his time and energy to doing something nice, like waxing his father's truck, for instance. When he did want a little pocket change, he didn't ask his parents, but instead went out and got hired on as a shoe shine boy at a local barber shop. As a teenager, Randy would attend Havre High School, where he performed very well academically. He had a zest for life and often wanted to be out, having a good time with friends and getting his hands dirty under the engine, but he never sacrificed his education, working hard and studying before he went out. His brother Robert explained, quote, "I was 1 year older than Randy, but we were in the same grade because I got left back. We were in the same classes. Randy was always very balanced. I'd come home and he'd be studying. He could party and still do well in school." End quote. Looking for more money as he got older, Randy was hired on at the Iron Horse restaurant where he worked as a dishwasher and busboy. Later on, he'd follow in his mother's footsteps, taking on the role of cook, and at one point, he ended up working beside Darlene while she was hired to help run the kitchen. Randy seemed to present almost an equal balance between his parents, having an innate ability with machinery and circuitry like his father, as well as a zest and drive in the food and care service industries like his mother. By the time Randy graduated from Havre High, his interest had become a little more mature as he traded in bikes and running around outside for motorcycles, dirt bikes, and rafting, with his interest in electronics never wavering. When he applied to attend Northern Montana College in the spring of 1982, he listed his interest as motorcycling, rafting, and computer programming, specifically for labor and payroll systems. He would go on to attend Northern Montana for just 2 semesters, from the fall of '82 until the spring, but the university didn't offer everything he wanted to pursue, and so he changed his focus, applying to and ultimately being accepted into Montana State University, where he matriculated as an electrical engineer major. Located in Bozeman, the seat of Gallatin County, some 270 miles south of Havre, Randy was extremely excited about all of the new opportunities and the greater and more vast curriculum offered by the school. Bruce McLeod, a former professor, was impressed by Randy's work ethic and determination, later noting, quote, "He worked awfully hard to get through school. He was a typical kid from Montana. He knew how to work, and he knew what he wanted." End quote. As he always did, Randy performed extremely well at MSU and somehow managed to balance his busy class schedule with friends, adventures, and a part-time job. In the fall of '83, he picked up work at a Bozeman area Pizza Hut located along Main Street. It was a short distance from campus and gave Randy the ability to make a little money, normally on the weekends. Coworkers noted that Randy was extremely hardworking and often went above and beyond his job requirements, quickly being promoted as he was not just your average college employee. He began as a waiter, was promoted to cook, and ultimately became a shift supervisor. This was a position which carried heavier responsibilities, such as balancing the books, adjusting sales, and working to maximize payroll. When Randy returned to MSU for the fall semester in 1984, he returned to work at the restaurant. On campus, he excelled in his classes and really seemed to be coming into his own. By the end of the semester, he'd earned 3 A's and 1 B for a GPA of 3.4. In addition to performing well academically, he was nominated to become a member of Tau Beta Pi, an engineering honor society. He returned home to Havre for the holidays that year, celebrating with friends and family. No one had any way of knowing at the time that it would be the last Christmas the church family would celebrate together, without the grief and loss of their brother and son. The spring semester of 1985 began without a hitch for Randy. He quickly acclimated to his new classes and picked up work again at Pizza Hut. As his plate had become a little more full, with classes becoming deeper and more intricate, he had his schedule set so that he worked around 15 hours a week only. By this point in time, Randy was one of the restaurant's most dedicated shift supervisors and one of the most reliable and trusted employees of that Pizza Hut, located at 2300 West Main Street, a little more than 1 mile from campus. Another shift supervisor at the store had requested the weekend of February 9th and 10th off, and so Randy agreed to take over his hours, where he was scheduled to close on Saturday the 9th and open on the morning of Sunday the 10th. Randy had opened and closed many times in the past, so this wasn't exactly out of the ordinary. However, as fate would have it, Randy would be the target of a senseless and violent crime, leaving him to be discovered dead that Sunday morning. Reports of the time state that Saturday the 9th was a normal busy day for the college area Pizza Hut. There was a steady flow of customers in and out of the dining room, many of them college students beginning their night of partying or grabbing something to eat on the way back to campus. The restaurant made a lot of its money through delivery at the time, with the dorms and student housing being the busiest areas. Saturdays were known to be busy nights for the restaurant, and this Saturday was no different. At the time, the store's operating hours for Saturday night had delivery and takeout offers ending at 11 p.m., while the restaurant itself closed at midnight. A little after midnight, transitioning to Sunday the 10th, Randy shut down the front lights and locked both the front and back doors of the building. From this point forward, nighttime cleaning began, which typically entailed wiping down tables, sweeping the dining area, cleaning the kitchen, scrubbing out the ovens, and prepping for the next day's opening shift. According to one co-worker, Randy was known as a slow closer. He didn't half-ass his work, and he wasn't going to leave the store below his own standards, and so those who were scheduled to close with him knew it would usually take a little longer than normal. According to the time cards, Randy decided to send most of the employees home just after midnight, keeping one behind simply because it was against company policy for an employee to be in the restaurant alone. For reasons that have never been completely explained, if in fact an answer is known, the time clock also reveals that Randy was still present in the store 3 hours later, when at 3 a.m., he allowed the other employee to leave. While investigators would later interview this employee, few if any details would ever be revealed. The employee has never been named, nor have they taken part in any interviews or discussions about Randy or the crime. The one question this person might possess, which is seemingly very valuable to the investigation, is why exactly Randy chose to let him go while he stayed behind alone. It's been theorized that since he was opening the next morning, he may have decided to do some of his schoolwork and then sleep in the office. He was scheduled to arrive Sunday morning at 9:30, so he may have simply decided it made more sense to sleep there for 6 hours rather than going home and having to get less sleep. It is curious to many who have examined this case that this detail has never been revealed if known. What kept Randy there that night is one of several lingering questions which continue to haunt the investigation and his family. At approximately 9:30 a.m. on that Sunday morning, an opening employee arrived at the restaurant but found the door locked. Knocking, he received no response, and so he made his way around to the back door, but again could get no answer. Frustrated, the employee went to a nearby payphone and dialed up restaurant manager Jeff Pierce. Pierce, awakened that Sunday morning, immediately had a bad feeling. It wasn't exactly uncommon for a Pizza Hut employee to be late or to not show up at all, but Randy had always been incredibly responsible and reliable. If he hadn't made it to the restaurant and hadn't called to explain why, Pierce assumed something had to have been wrong. He never imagined it would be a fatal situation. Arriving at the restaurant at approximately 10 a.m., Pierce unlocked the door and he and the scheduled employee walked inside. They were quickly confronted by a grisly scene. Randy, clearly the victim of a shooting, lie motionless in close proximity to a cash register and the safe. It was apparent from those first moments that the bright, talented, and caring 23-year-old was dead. Pierce quickly dialed 911 and frantically detailed the horrible scene. Randy's murder would become infamous, not just for the fact that it remains unsolved to this day, but at the time, he was the first victim of a homicide inside of Bozeman city limits in over 8 years. Investigators arriving on the scene quickly identified 2 small-caliber gunshot wounds in Randy's head. Gallatin County Coroner Doris Fisher, upon conducting the autopsy, would identify 1 wound in Randy's right cheek and a second in the back of the neck. Interestingly, the death certificate would later note, quote, "Deceased was shot in the head from 2 directions," end quote. The gunshots had not exited Randy's skull, and the coroner managed to recover the bullets, identified as .22 caliber, and estimated that the 23-year-old's time of death had occurred at approximately 3 a.m., right around the same time that other employee had left. 2 bullets would be shipped out to the state crime lab in Missoula for further examination. On Sunday morning, as the news quickly spread, investigators noted that it was too early for them to have developed any motive or suspects, and that any information would be put together pending their examination of the scene and interviews with potential witnesses. Sergeant Ron Green, one of Bozeman's police department's most experienced investigators, was placed in charge of the case. While his career had been winding down and he was approaching retirement, his work on this case would cause him to push his retirement date back several times as he became deeply enveloped in trying to determine who had killed Randy and why. Examination of the scene seemed to indicate the possibility of a robbery gone wrong. .22 caliber shell casings were recovered at the scene, suggesting the shooter had likely used a semi-automatic handgun. Working with the restaurant manager, police were able to confirm that a small amount of money was missing from the store, but strangely, Randy's wallet was still in his pocket and hadn't been touched. There was no evidence of a struggle, nothing to easily explain why gunfire might have occurred, and the autopsy failed to find any wounds on the body to suggest any type of a fight or struggle. While investigators tried to wrap their heads around why someone would kill a young man to rob a restaurant but not take his wallet, Sergeant Green was trying to figure out just how in the hell the shooter had gotten inside. The front door was securely locked, as was the back, as evidenced by the fact that the employee that morning couldn't get in. It began to seem as though Randy had to have opened a door and allowed the killer inside. While the front door of the restaurant was glass and allowed Randy to see who was there, the back door, used by employees, had a peephole. But with the blowing snow and the darkness with no lights in the parking lot, employees noted it was often difficult to actually see anyone through that peephole. It was theorized that Randy was either expecting someone that night and opened the door to a knock only to find an armed assailant, or perhaps that the person who killed Randy was in fact someone he knew. Through interviews, they would later learn it was not uncommon for friends and coworkers to visit late at night via that back door. By the morning of Monday, February 11th, investigators were working on several different leads. Saturday night had been a busy one for crime in Bozeman and the surrounding area, and investigators were trying to determine if there was any possibility that the crimes could all be connected. At approximately 9 p.m., someone carrying a small caliber weapon, possibly a .22, had robbed a town pump gas station in Livingston, less than 30 miles east of Bozeman. The suspect had worn a paper bag over his head and garbage bags over his clothing, and had fled the scene after the attendant handed over the money from the register. The suspect was described as standing approximately 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighing around 175 pounds. There was also a break-in and burglary reported at another town pump gas station, this time in Bozeman itself. Few details were released, however, it was noted that $911 was stolen, and the gas station was located just 0.3 of a mile from the Pizza Hut, southwest along Main Street, or what Google Maps determined to be a 7-minute walk. This second crime, the one in Bozeman, piqued the interest of investigators who wondered if the suspect had broken into the gas station and then walked over to the Pizza Hut, assumed it was empty, and broke in only to find Randy inside. Unfortunately, unlike the crime in Livingston, they had no witnesses, no details about the suspect, and seemingly no solid information about exactly what time the crime had occurred, making it difficult to try and link it to any of the other crimes. In hopes of obtaining more information and potential witnesses, the Bozeman Police Department sent information regarding the crime to different law enforcement agencies across the state and to the local media. Pizza Hut, in hopes of assisting, offered a $1,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the killer or killers. A fund was set up to grow the reward money, allowing for donations to be made through the Bank of Bozeman. While the restaurant would stay closed throughout Sunday and Monday, when investigators finished working the scene, it was scheduled to open again on the morning of Tuesday, February 12th. Back on the home front, things were difficult for Randy's parents and siblings. They were devastated by the news of his murder and went through a gamut of emotions. They wanted to know why someone had murdered such a kind and loving young man, a brother and son who would never harm someone else. At the time, the family wasn't ready to do much press, but Randy's sister Ruby would be quoted by the Montana Standard saying, quote, "He was good and never hurt anybody. He cared. He cared a lot about people." End quote. Randy's body was returned to his native Havre, and a funeral was held on Thursday, February 14th, Valentine's Day, at the Holland and Bonine Chapel. Randy was laid to rest in Highland Cemetery beneath a stone with his photograph enshrined there. A memorial service was also held for Randy at the Danforth Chapel on the campus of MSU, where many professors and fellow students came to show their love and share their grief. In response to the terrible crime, the college initiated an annual scholarship in Randy's name. It was a difficult time for the church family, and it would only grow more painful each day his killer went unidentified and free. Sergeant Ron Green noted that they had been receiving a lot of calls, some from people who believed they had information, others from different law enforcement departments seeking details of the crime to compare to their own unsolved murders and robberies. Unfortunately, much of the information relayed was quickly ruled out, as Sergeant Green explained, quote, "We sent out a teletype and people are responding to it. We've also had a lot of calls from local people who thought they might have seen things, but so far, the times don't match." End quote. While many of the law enforcement agencies contacting Bozeman were within the state of Montana, they did receive a ballistics request from Minot, North Dakota, some 600 miles northeast of the city. On Friday, February 9th, an elderly couple had been murdered, and local investigators were desperate for any possible leads. While Bozeman police sent over their information, Sergeant Green didn't think there would likely be a connection because it appeared a different type of weapon had been used in that crime. They would also receive calls from Tucson and Phoenix, but again, details simply didn't match up well enough to suggest any connections. Despite a lack of developments, Green noted they were still working on a lot of different angles, and there were 4 officers assigned to the case. He would tell the Billings Gazette, quote, "Things are moving along in the investigation. We are eliminating a lot of things right now. We've received a lot of calls, and we will follow them up. "We're not lost." End quote. Several weeks would pass, with investigators continuing to gather evidence and information. On Monday, February 25th, Livingston police got a break in their investigation into the town pump robbery and apprehended 25-year-old James Allen Livermore. Reportedly, Livermore had previously been in possession of a .22 caliber semi-automatic handgun, though he did not have it on him at the time of his arrest. The Missoula County Sheriff's Department, assisting the Livingston PD, recovered the pistol from a local resident who reported that Livermore had borrowed the weapon from him prior to the crime. Livermore was charged with robbery for threatening the gas attendant with the gun and escaping with $700. While he was held in custody, investigators from Bozeman were able to question him about Randy's crime, though Livermore claimed he had no knowledge of it and had not been involved. The robbery weapon was sent to the crime lab in Missoula so that it could be compared to the bullets and shells recovered from Randy's murder. A week later, though, the report came back that the bullets which had killed Randy had not been fired from Livermore's gun, and while that eliminated one potential avenue for investigators, it allowed them to focus on several others. Curiously, it would be a pair of escaped convicts from New Mexico that would quickly become the targets of intense scrutiny from the Bozeman Police Department as well as the FBI. 53-year-old Ray Scrivener and 37-year-old Mark St. Clair, along with several others, escaped from a state prison in Albuquerque on Monday, January 7th. After splitting up from the others, Scrivener and St. Clair stole a beige 1983 Mazda in Colorado and began heading north, with their goal being to cross into Canada. The two men were apprehended by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police on February 21st, at which time it was learned that they had crossed the border the day after Randy was murdered. A map recovered in their stolen vehicle had a route drawn on it which traveled north from Colorado, entering Montana along Highway 87 southeast of Billings, and then continuing west to Bozeman. Several witnesses would come forward, telling Bozeman police they had seen two similar-looking men in the vicinity of the Pizza Hut the night Randy was killed. Scrivener was serving a 20-year sentence for armed robbery and kidnapping, while St. Clair was serving a 30-year sentence for the murder of a deputy sheriff. Sergeant Ron Green traveled to Canada to question the two escapees before they could be extradited back to the United States. Green arrived on Monday, March 18th, and was able to interview both men, whom he would go on to describe as the most likely suspects. He stated that the men were linked to the crime by several details: the map in their vehicle, which he further expanded on, saying that it showed they had traveled from Billings to Bozeman and back to Billings the night of the murder. Sergeant Green obtained the suspect's fingerprints, which were sent out to be compared to prints obtained at the Pizza Hut. Unfortunately, with it being a public restaurant, there were a lot of fingerprints to sort through. However, another detail caught Green's attention and caused him to look deeper at the suspects. When Randy had been killed, there was quite a bit of snow on the ground in Bozeman, and police had taken multiple photographs of unidentified tire prints in the restaurant parking lot. Believing that the tires on the stolen Mazda matched up closely with the prints at the scene, Green took the tires with him when he flew back to the United States, at which time they were sent to the FBI for analysis and comparison. Green noted they had found footprints in the snow at the Pizza Hut, and they appeared to match up with the shoe sizes of the two prison escapees. While it would likely be impossible to get a conclusive match, Green noted one of the men wore a size 14+ shoe and the other a much smaller shoe, and these were very similar to the prints left in the snow. According to Green, another thing that made him suspicious occurred during his interviews. One of the suspects scoffed at the idea of robbing a Pizza Hut, reportedly saying, quote, "How much money would a pizza place have? No more than $900? End quote. Interestingly enough, the actual amount stolen from the restaurant totaled $1,100. Pretty close, Sergeant Green thought. It was around this time that investigators revealed a detail of the crime that they had previously kept under wraps. Following their examination of the restaurant, investigators had recovered both the bank bag and the check bag utilized by that Pizza Hut. The bags were found along Jackrabbit Lane near Belgrade, less than 10 miles northwest from the crime scene. These checks were also sent in to the FBI for analysis, as investigators hoped to try and match fingerprints with the prison escapees, but at this point, the investigation drew to a dramatically slow pace. Awaiting the results of tests from the FBI would take months longer than expected. In July, 5 months after the murder, Bozeman police still did not have any solid information. Asked about the delay from the FBI, a spokesperson for the lab in Washington noted that it was very difficult to compare the tire tracks because of all of the different patterns through the various manufacturers. While the tire tracks were still up in the air, the FBI did return that they had been unable to uncover any fingerprints off of the 25 checks that investigators had sent in. According to the lab, the results of all fingerprint testing was inconclusive. That struck Sergeant Green as difficult to accept. He would later note in a letter to the editor of the Bozeman Daily Chronicle that he found it highly unlikely they'd been unable to find even a single print from the pizza place where everyone has grease on their fingers. Not even employee prints were found on the checks. It didn't make a lot of sense to the seasoned detective. Although Sergeant Green sent all of his information about the two suspects into the district attorney's office, they elected not to hold a hearing, nor to even bring the suspects to Bozeman for additional questioning. Green would later state, quote, "The Gallatin County attorney, Marty Lambert, decided not to bring them to Bozeman for a hearing. They were being returned to prison in New Mexico, and they were being charged for escape." End quote. Sadly, the two men were returned to New Mexico, and while Green believed they were likely firm suspects, the bureaucracy of prosecutors and the red tape of differing states seems to have won out over the search for justice. Sergeant Green would later express his unfiltered opinion, noting his belief that Randy's murder went unsolved because of politics and money. He explained, quote, "I really did believe they were involved. Without my testimony at a hearing, I was lost, and felt it was the Gallatin County attorney who did not want to waste his time if they were returning to prison anyway." End quote. Green wasn't alone in his beliefs, with many feeling that the decision had been made not to charge the men or pursue further investigation because they were going back to prison and would likely never get out. And so some may have seen it as a waste of time and money to try and convict men who were already locked up for the rest of their lives. As you can imagine, no one who worked the investigation or who knew and loved Randy found that to be even remotely close to a satisfactory decision. Instead, investigators were told there was not enough evidence to link the men to the crime and they would need to pursue new avenues. Progress was slow. With the escapees off the board, investigators were reset back to square one. The summer and fall would pass with no new developments or leads, or at least none that were noteworthy enough to catch headlines in the local or national media. Then, in December, 10 months after the murder, a new suspect emerged. 19-year-old Michael Lane Nicholson, formerly of Livingston, was arrested and charged with a murder in Wyoming. Randy Dean Red Dog of Wolf Point had been beaten to death in Yellowstone Park, not far from Old Faithful, in the summer of 1984. While Nicholson sat in a Cheyenne area jail, a cellmate told authorities that the 19-year-old had told him that he had been involved in Randy's murder. Authorities notified the FBI, who arrived to interview Nicholson, but the suspect refused to discuss anything about the murder and denied any involvement. Interestingly, just weeks prior to the murder, Nicholson had been arrested and charged with robbing the Heritage Inn in Bozeman, located just 2.5 miles east of the Pizza Hut. Nicholson would be found guilty of the crime, with investigators noting that no weapon had been used. He was placed on probation and was out on his own recognizance when the murder took place. Nicholson had previously been a suspect in an arson case targeting Livingston Middle School and was later charged with burglarizing a Livingston area grocery store the same night as that fire. Regardless of his extensive criminal history and having committed similar crimes, Nicholson was never conclusively linked to Randy's murder. Without new suspects or new evidence, investigators turned their attention back to the crime scene and the question that they believed was a linchpin in this case. How had the killer gained entry to the restaurant? The back door was believed to have been the most likely entry point, since Randy could have seen the assailant through the glass at the front door. Also, the back door was frequently used when friends and coworkers came to visit. However, some noted that the back door was not necessarily the most secure either. While the door was always locked at midnight, there may have been a defect with the latch. Susie Williams, a friend of Randy's who was dating a Pizza Hut employee at the time of the murder, noted that she had been present on different occasions after closing when customers had wandered in through that back door. Apparently, the door would lock behind people as they left, but if it didn't close properly, it simply wouldn't lock. Asked her thoughts about the murder, Williams was baffled, noting how liked and friendly Randy was. She told the Montana Review, quote, "Unless it was something extremely personal no one knew about, I couldn't think of any reason someone would want to do that to Randy." End quote. Unfortunately, the case began growing cold, and it went from an active investigation to one which was worked on when time allowed to finding its way into the filing cabinet where cold cases were stored. In April of 1987, 2 years and 2 months after the murder, Sergeant Stan Tenney announced that a team which often tackled cold and unsolved cases, the Rocky Mountain Information Network, had agreed to study the case. Tenney noted the team would be given access to investigative files in an attempt to determine if there was any evidence or leads missed or angles of investigation that had not been fully pursued. Asked about the theory revolving around the 2 prison escapees and the status of the case 2 years later, Tenney replied, quote, "They were not eliminated as suspects, but there's not enough to charge them. We're hoping for a break in the case to help us solve it. We have so few clues and nobody who can really tell us what happened. It's very frustrating. It's serious and drastic enough that a guy says this case must be solved, but he can't spend all of his time on it." End quote. Tenney went on to state that the case deeply frustrated him, saying he was completely boggled by it. While it was not what anyone wanted to hear, especially the family, Tenney noted that sadly, some cases never get solved. The Cold Case Review did not appear to dredge up any new information, leads, or suspects, or at least none which were revealed to the public. 6 months later, in October of 1987, Randy's father, Richard, conducted a short interview with the Montana Standard. He made it clear that the murder of his son had devastated him, but simultaneously expressed his frustration with a system he felt had failed to find the killer. Richard stated he had little faith police would solve the case, and even if they did, he didn't believe true justice would be delivered. He explained, quote, "If they do find the guy, they won't do anything about it. They'll throw him in prison and feed the sucker, and that ain't good enough in my book. They should catch the guy and give him the same medicine he gave my son, and I'd like to do it." End quote. From this point forward, the status of Randy's case and what work being done was severely limited. When tips came in, they would be pursued, and the file would be gone through periodically, but it appeared to be little more than a matter of protocol rather than a devoted and passionate investigation. For the Church family, they could never forget, and while they grappled with the loss of their brother and son, they found themselves frustrated by the inability of investigators to solve the case or even bring charges. It would turn out that the pain and grief was too much for Richard and Darlene, who would divorce. Richard remained in Havre, while Darlene sought a new environment from which to start a new life. Randy's sister Ruby would later note that throughout their childhoods, their father had been somewhat distant and difficult to get close to, while Darlene had always been open and warm. In the aftermath of Randy's death, they had seemed to reverse roles, with Richard drawing his children closer to him as Darlene withdrew. She moved to Idaho and remarried, trying to put the pieces of her life back together. Sadly, Richard passed away at the age of 77 on Saturday, October 30th, 2010. To his last day, he desperately hoped that someday the answers would be found and justice would be served. He had spent much of his free time visiting the grave of his son, and after his passing, Richard was interred beside Randy, with the two sharing a simple stone that reads, "Father, Son, together forever." Darlene passed 7 years later on Thursday, September 7th, 2017, at the age of 80 in Boise. Neither parent ever learned the truth nor saw justice for their beloved son, and while they had moved forward with their lives and tried to live to the best of their abilities, a never-ending pain and grief remained with them for the rest of their days. 3 of Randy's 4 siblings would go on to name one of their children after their beloved brother. As the decades rang on, they participated in interviews, gave quotes to local papers, and urged investigators to finally solve the case. The case was once again being looked over by cold case investigators in November of 2010, but considering the absence of solid physical evidence, there was little that could be re-examined given the emergence of new and advanced forensic technologies. In April of 2021, 36 years after Randy was murdered, Detective Benjamin King made an appeal to the public for information. He, along with Detective Joseph Swanson, were digging back into the case in hopes of unearthing something, finding some clue or lead that had previously been missed, but both acknowledged if the case was to be solved, they would need help from outside of their investigation. Detective Swanson explained to KBZK News 7, saying, quote, "Anything anyone has to tell us, we will listen to you no matter how small. You will not be bothering us. The DNA evidence can only be as good as what the piece of paper tells us, because we want to find out what the motive was or what all those other specifics are behind it." End quote. Investigators were joined by the family in their call for assistance in finding the truth of who killed Randy and why. Speaking to News 7, Randy's sister Ruby pleaded, quote, "Somebody out there knows something, somewhere. They've got to. My biggest question is why? What was so important that you had to kill him? If you know something, you've got to come forward. You've got to be coming forward. Somebody knows something, and we just want answers." End quote. Ruby was joined by her brothers, Robert and Rick, who hoped that someone would finally come forward to tell what they knew. It was unlikely that, all of these years later, there weren't people out there with some knowledge of the crime, even if only on the periphery. Rick struggled to accept how much time had passed and how little progress had been made. He explained, quote, "I think if we had known it was going to go for so long, we would have done things differently. Here we are, 36 years later, and still no answers. If they are still around, they need to pay the price." End quote. The latest information from investigators came out in October of 2021, when detectives noted they were continuing to work the case, and while they could not reveal details about new information uncovered or what angles they were pursuing, they did note that the more attention the case got, the more tips and trickles of information they would receive. As of today, Randy's murder remains the sole unsolved homicide on the books in Bozeman for the last 50 years. A $10,000 reward for information remains in place, and investigators have both a tip line and an email address where tips and leads can be submitted. 23-year-old Randall Roy Randy Church was murdered at the Bozeman Pizza Hut, 2300 West Main Street, at approximately 3 a.m. on the morning of Sunday, February 10th, 1985. Randy was working a closing shift and was alone in the restaurant following an employee leaving around 3 a.m. Police have never determined how the killer or killers gained entry, whether Randy let them in, or if it may have been someone he knew and trusted. The killer utilized a semi-automatic .22 caliber pistol and shot Randy twice. The murder was senseless and needless, as Randy did not appear to refuse the suspect's orders to hand over the store's money from that night, and no sign of a struggle was found. While robbery is considered the primary motive, others believe it may have been part of a cover-up to protect the identity of someone who may have known Randy and remained in Bozeman after the crime was committed. 39 years have passed since Randy Church was brutally murdered while working at Pizza Hut. Over all of that time, no charges have been filed, no suspects confirmed. There have been different names considered at different times, but there's never been enough to move beyond the realm of speculation. For Sergeant Green, he remains convinced the two prison escapees were responsible, but he acknowledged that there wasn't enough evidence to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Others believe Michael Nicholson was involved, though he could never be conclusively connected. Still yet others believe that the killer is a name which has never made it into newspaper articles and reports, perhaps a coworker, maybe even that same person who moved into Randy's former apartment shortly before his murder. One thing seems for certain, someone knows something, and unless they come forward, Randy and his family may never find the answers they so desperately seek. Asked about the crime remaining unsolved all of these decades later, Randy's brother Bob told News 7, quote, "For people that may know something about this, if they could imagine, if they had someone that they really loved that had that happen to them, how would they feel? Imagine someone is taken away from you and someone knows something about it. You'd want them to speak up too, because it's totally wrong. Because someone took him away for no freaking reason. It's totally wrong." Nearly 40 years have passed since 23-year-old Randy Church was violently and senselessly murdered. Sadly, for the vast majority of that time, there have been few breakthroughs and developments. Tracking the case, it was active for the first 2 years, and then, for whatever reason, things began falling off. A lack of evidence, a lack of tips, a lack of avenues to explore. As time moved forward for the residents of Bozeman, it was frozen for Randy's family and friends. They couldn't understand how someone could commit such a heinous and needless crime and just walk away without ever being captured or even identified. Perhaps what stung most was knowing that after those first few years, the case grew dormant, and it didn't seem like anyone was really trying to find Randy's killer. The case had grown cold, and newspapers even saw it as old news. Across the last 4 decades, they've been outspoken and have urged both the local community and police to do whatever is necessary to solve the case and to bring their brother's killer to justice. Several theories developed over the years. Different people were considered suspects, but there was never a charge filed or an arrest made. For investigators, it always seemed that they were just one key piece of evidence away from being able to move forward, but it never materialized. The FBI was unable to match the tire prints to the tires taken off the prison escapee's car. No fingerprints were recovered from the checks found after the murder. They never found the murder weapon and have been unable to match the slug or shells to any gun that they've tested. In 2015, investigators began talking about DNA and sought to get samples from members of the family, but what that DNA was compared to has never been explained. Investigators have mentioned running old evidence through new technology, but they've never made clear what that evidence is. While detectives have expressed the importance of keeping some information close to the vest, the family has been frustrated by the utter lack of transparency and have sought to find answers to questions they've been asking since 1985. While the family has been very cordial about the investigation publicly and how it was handled, it's clear as time has gone on that they may regret the way things were done, and in hindsight, they wish it had been handled differently. In an unsolved case like this, where a young man is murdered at work in a public location at a time when he probably shouldn't even have been there, it's hard to imagine it was just random. Many people think there has to be some connection between Randy and his killer, with police arguing that the only way the killer got inside that Pizza Hut was to have been either let in by Randy or if the door wasn't latched right. As you might imagine, a lot of different theories have developed over these 39 years. Only one really received a lot of coverage and in-depth investigation, and to this day remains the primary theory held by original investigator Ron Green. The theory that Randy was killed by the duo of prison escapees, Ray Scrivener and Mark St. Clair. From the get-go, the two pretty much fit the bill of the kind of suspects you might be looking for in this case. St. Clair was serving 30 years for murder of a law enforcement officer, while Scrivener was serving 20 for armed robbery and kidnapping. The two escaped from a prison in Albuquerque on January 7th, 34 days before Randy was killed. According to investigators, the two men stole a car from Colorado and started heading north with plans of crossing into Canada. The journey to Bozeman would carry the two escapees more than 1,000 miles, and while there seems to be a lot of information about the end and how they were captured, there are few details about the trip itself and where exactly they had been. Scrivener and St. Clair were considered potential suspects in a number of crimes over the course of the next few weeks. On Friday, February 9th, approximately 36 hours before Randy was killed, Charles and Cora Abernathy, an elderly couple living in Minot, North Dakota, were brutally murdered in their home. Both had been shot through the head and had their throats slashed. Cora was found in the couple's bed as she was immobile recovering from hip surgery, while Charles was found on the living room floor. The home had been ransacked, but the couple were hardly wealthy, and it was estimated that whoever had committed the murders made off with little more than $300. Curiously, as was the case with Randy, while robbery appeared to be the motive, Charles Abernathy still had cash in his pocket that the killers never took. While there were differences between the two crimes, there were some similarities, and initially Minot authorities reached out to the Bozeman police to compare forensics and ballistics. Ultimately, it was determined that the gun used at the Abernathys was not the same as the one that had killed Randy. Either way, when Scrivener and St. Clair were captured by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, they were taken to Minot for questioning. Neither of the escapees was involved in the double murder, with authorities later arresting Calvin Arthur Newman and Kevin Austin, who were convicted of the heinous crime. While there was little, if any, evidence outside of their criminal records to link either Scrivener or St. Clair to the Abernathy murders, there was some compelling evidence that suggested they had been involved in Randy's murder. There was the map found in the stolen vehicle, which showed a hand-drawn route that would carry the escapees into Montana via Highway 87. They would proceed to Billings, then turn west to Bozeman. This placed them in Bozeman around the time of the murder, and as chance would have it, the two men crossed into Canada the very next day. According to Sergeant Green, several witnesses had stated that they believed they had seen people matching the escapees' descriptions in the area of the Pizza Hut in the hours leading up to the crime. These sightings, however, do not appear to have ever been fully corroborated. Sergeant Green, believing these men were his suspects, traveled to Canada where he was able to question them, and according to him, they made several statements that he found suspicious. One of the felons noted he wouldn't bother robbing a Pizza Hut as he would only expect to get no more than $900. As it turned out, the amount stolen that night totaled $900 in cash and touched just $1,100 when the checks were added in. Coincidence? Or was this an indication the man had knowledge of the crime that only the person responsible could? Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to go on. So, Sergeant Green grabs the tires off the car and has them shipped to the FBI for comparison to the tracks left at the restaurant, but they can't make a link. The bag of checks, found discarded in the street after the murder, is also examined, but no fingerprints are captured on any of the 25 checks. It's difficult to simply dismiss this evidence as circumstantial, but at least in the eyes of the district attorney's office, detectives did not have enough to warrant bringing the two men to Bozeman for a hearing. Strangely, there was vastly less evidence linking them to the Minot double homicide, and yet their DA certainly felt it was worth bringing them in for questioning, but, as has been made clear through a lot of the coverage of this case, while some seek justice at all costs, others would prefer to balance their budgets. For their part, neither Scrivener nor St. Clair ever admitted or even alluded to their involvement in Randy's murder as far as we know. They were later returned to New Mexico where they faced additional charges and, according to local reports, Both men later died of natural causes while serving their sentences. It would appear, if in fact they were responsible for Randy's murder, something more would be needed to confirm it. No gun was found in their possession, no evidence from the Pizza Hut, nothing to conclusively link them, and as it stands today, they are a popular theory, but little more than that. Given Sergeant Green's devotion to the case and his determination to solve it, it would seem that he did everything he could to try and prove their involvement, but he just couldn't. Whether or not things would have gone differently had the district attorney elected to bring them to Bozeman for questioning is sadly just one of those questions we'll never have an answer to. While I believe Scrivener and St. Clair are good possibilities and certainly should have been questioned and investigated more deeply, there's also a part of me that can't help but feel like while they fit the bill of what you might be looking for here, they don't really fit in any way that can be proven. For me, the issue is this. You're on the run. You need a car, so you steal it. You need money, so you rob some places along the way. Of all the places to rob, who the hell selects a Pizza Hut at 3 a.m.? One would have to assume all of the cash would already be locked in the safe by that time since they closed hours earlier. On top of that, Randy had turned off the lights and locked up the doors hours earlier, leaving the store appearing dark and empty. Investigators have never understood how the killer or killers got inside, noting that it was either Randy who opened the door or that someone entered because it hadn't latched properly. The way this Pizza Hut is laid out is kind of strange. The building is rectangular shaped and runs north to south and has a parking lot to the west, which is shared by an apartment complex. The front door to the building faces this parking lot, while the back door faces north and is approximately 70 feet south of West Babcock Street. The southern edge of the building faces towards West Main Street or US Highway 191. Driving down Main Street at night, the building would be dark and would seem to be empty. For the killer to have gained entry through the back door, he would need to turn into the parking lot off either West Main or West Babcock. He would then proceed to the back door, which is situated near dumpsters and a small storage building. Today, that door has a large window in it, but back in 1985, it had only a small peephole. According to employees, if it was late at night, the parking lot would have been dark and the peephole wouldn't really function, as looking through it, an employee would see only darkness and vague shapes of people, but no fine details. What bothers me here is that there's no sign of forced entry. That would suggest that if the inmates were responsible, they would have gone to the door and either knocked on it on the off chance that someone was still inside at 3 a.m. and let them in, or they would try and break in, at which time perhaps Randy could have heard them and come to check the door. We know, not long before the murder, that a gas station less than 3/10 of a mile away was robbed, but there doesn't appear to be any attempt to link the escapees to that crime. So it would lead us to believe that on that night/early Sunday morning, someone was robbing the gas station while two escapees were forcing their way into Pizza Hut. Surely it's possible, it just doesn't seem probable. I guess what makes Scrivener and St. Clair more compelling is that they were criminals who had conducted similar crimes. They were on the run and desperate. They weren't shy about being violent, and murder was just a part of their repertoire. It isn't difficult to imagine one or both of them wouldn't think twice about killing a 23-year-old man over a matter of barely $1,100. It just feels off to me. Like, of all places to go that night, why Pizza Hut? Why not another gas station or convenience store or any place where you can just point a gun at someone and they'll hand you cash? Now, maybe that's just me. Perhaps they saw something or heard something that made them target the Pizza Hut, but I really struggle to rationalize it. At the same time, crimes like this are hardly ever rational. So, were Scrivener and St. Clair involved? Sadly, there's just no way to know for certain. I tend to lean against this theory. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and while I think there's plenty of reason to consider both men capable of a crime like this, I just can't find a way to understand what would have brought them to that Pizza Hut in the first place. Moving on, we turn our attention to 19-year-old Michael Lane Nicholson. Nicholson was arrested in September of '85, 5 months after Randy's murder, at which time he was charged with the brutal murder of 22-year-old Randy Dean Red Dog in Yellowstone National Park. According to the medical examiner, Red Dog died as a result of massive head trauma and skull fractures from being beaten with a blunt object. Both Red Dog and Nicholson were employed at that time by a vendor operating out of the park, and as such were kind of co-workers. In February of 1986, Nicholson pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter in the murder. This crime seemingly showed that Nicholson possessed not only the ability to commit a violent homicide, but that he had a propensity towards it. This, however, would be the middle of a long list of crimes committed by Nicholson. Just a few weeks after Randy's murder in March of '85, Nicholson was charged with robbery. He would go on to plead guilty, admitting that at 4 a.m. on Monday, March 18th, he had climbed over the counter of the Western Heritage Inn, located in Bozeman, violently shoved the female clerk to the floor, and stole $135 before making off into the night. No weapon was used in that robbery. Nicholson was also considered a suspect in an arson which took place at Livingston Middle School on Saturday, September 7th, 1985. A massive fire gutted the school's wood frame central section, built in 1904, and severely damaged concrete outer wings built decades later. In addition to that, Nicholson was also charged with robbing a Livingston area grocery store. The grocery store robbery, the school arson, and the murder of Randy Red Dog all happened within the same 24-hour period, and at the time, Nicholson was on probation after receiving a suspended sentence for the Heritage Inn robbery. Now, while Nicholson certainly showed a tendency towards violence and robbery, there was no solid evidence to ever link him to Randy's murder. The only thing that ever did point that way occurred when another inmate told authorities that Nicholson had claimed to have been responsible for the robbery and murder at the Pizza Hut. Learning this, officials with the FBI sent an agent to question Nicholson, but he denied any involvement and didn't want to speak any further. That's pretty much where his story comes to an end. Obviously a likely culprit and a good person to look at as a potential suspect, but due to a lack of physical evidence, investigators noted that they had never been able to find anything that could confirm that Nicholson had even been at the Pizza Hut that night. There was also nothing which seemed to show or link him to the use or possession of a .22 caliber handgun like the one used in the murder. Nicholson comes up here as an interesting angle to pursue. He has the means and the opportunity, violence doesn't seem to mean much to him, and he murders a 22-year-old by beating him to death, so I doubt shooting a 23-year-old would have made much of a difference to him. The problem seems to be that Nicholson targets places with easy access to cash, a clerk working behind the counter of an inn, a grocery store, places where he can grab cash and run pretty much. I can't give you much more detail about the murder or why he committed it, but it is notable that he then commits one more crime that night and is a suspect in another that occurs the same night. Much like the escapees, Nicholson's rap sheet certainly makes him a likely suspect, but again, there's nothing to tie him to it. No physical evidence, no witnesses, nothing beyond an alleged jailhouse bragging confession. I run into the same issues and questions that I did with the escapees. What would bring Nicholson to that Pizza Hut? Most of his crimes take place where he was living at the time, in Livingston, 30 miles east of Bozeman. Surely he could have made the trip, and robbery does seem to be up his alley, and he's not shy about committing murder, but again, how does he get into the restaurant? Where did the gun go that he apparently used only for this one crime? Why wasn't he more fervently pursued? Well, while Nicholson appears to be just the kind of garbage you'd expect to commit a crime like this, there doesn't appear to be anything to conclusively link him to Randy or the crime. There's one article, though, that raises an interesting question. In 2022, the Montana Review noted that many suspects have not officially been cleared in this case. One of those suspects they identify as a man who served time for murder in Wyoming and who was in Bozeman the night of the shooting. It goes on to note that this suspect also knew Randy Church, though it doesn't go into detail of the hows or whys. It sounds like they're describing Nicholson here as he served time in Wyoming for the murder of Red Dog. If there are conclusive links between he and Randy, that would certainly be more compelling, but as of now, there doesn't appear to be any further elaboration, and in fairness, it's possible this article could have been referring to someone else, although that seems somewhat unlikely. So with the escapees and Nicholson out of the way, there's really only one other possibility that's gained much attention. There are some who believe that there was nothing random about this crime, that it wasn't a robbery gone wrong, but instead a personal issue between someone and Randy himself. Now, everyone who knew Randy struggled to think of anyone who could have had a problem with him. He was such a nice and caring guy. He made friends easily. He was handsome, smart, and driven. While it's hard to understand, there are people out there who will despise you for no reason other than the fact that other people like you. It's certainly possible that someone felt wronged or jealous of Randy and wanted to get back at him one way or another. To me, I've never been able to shake the possibility that Randy was either killed by a friend, someone he believed he could trust, or possibly a coworker. As we've discussed previously, investigators theorize only two ways that back door opened. It didn't latch properly, or Randy opened it, unknowingly inviting his killer inside. There is, though, a third possibility that doesn't seem to get a lot of traction. There were other employees who had keys to that restaurant. Randy wasn't the only one. I don't know how thoroughly police dug into his coworkers, but my focus would have first been on anyone who had keys. Curiously, there is some information floating around out there about an unnamed suspect who not only worked at that restaurant, but who also rented out an apartment that Randy had previously lived in. Reportedly, in emails exchanged between Bozeman investigators and Randy's family, there came mention of this person. It was reported that prior to his murder, Randy had moved out of an apartment located then at 301 West Story Street, a mile and a half west of the Pizza Hut. This coworker moved in right after, though little other detail is given as to whether Randy helped this person get the apartment or what the link between the apartment and the murder might be, if any link at all. Either way, it perfectly fits in with what seems like the most likely scenario here. Another employee would know the ins and outs of the restaurant, and if they knew Randy well, there's a good chance they'd have known he was in that building at 3 a.m. Now, there's no way of knowing for sure, but it would be really helpful to know the name of what employee stayed behind that night with Randy. Remember, Randy sends everybody home at midnight except for one person. That one person stays with him and then, according to time cards, clocks out at 3 a.m. and presumably leaves. It's pretty difficult to ignore the fact that the medical examiner also determined Randy's time of death was right around 3 a.m. One could argue that maybe Randy and this employee didn't get along well, though if that were the case, I can't imagine asking that person that I don't get along with to stay behind with me for 3 hours alone in the restaurant from midnight to 3. Also, if you're going to murder him, why wait until 3 a.m. in the first place? It's all rather strange, but what about this case makes any sense? The fact of the matter is, I can't explain why two prison escapees might show up that night, or why Nicholson would, or why any number of other potential suspects would be out in that parking lot at 3 a.m. in 5-degree weather on the off chance that someone is still inside to let them in, or that they might try to break in. However, an employee is a different story, especially if this wasn't about robbery, but was really about killing Randy. It doesn't have to be the person who left at 3 a.m., though that feels really strange. What if someone else, someone who was waiting for that other employee to leave, was sitting in the parking lot in their car so they could let themselves in and murder Randy for reasons unknown? Or it could have been an employee that Randy did let in that night. Maybe they knock on the back door and he recognizes them and whips the door open only to find himself confronted with a gun. The fact of the matter is, you've already got the gun in your possession, then it seems unlikely that you're just looking to grab some fast cash. This wasn't a crime that was sloppy or pulled off like someone who didn't know what they were doing. They fired a shot directly into Randy's face, and then when he collapsed, they fired a kill shot from behind. This was an execution, and the money seems to have been completely secondary. Remember, they didn't even take Randy's wallet. Of course, if it was an employee, why the hell did they take that check bag? They would have likely have known it was just checks and there was nothing for them to do with it, but maybe that was all part of convincing everyone that it was a robbery. What happened that fateful night in February of 1985 when Randy Church was shot to death inside of the Pizza Hut along West Main Street? Was it the work of two desperate prison escapees trying to get their hands on as much cash as they could in an attempt to get to Canada and start anew? Was it the work of Michael Nicholson, a violent criminal with a tendency towards murder and robbery? Could it have been a coworker, perhaps one who had a personal issue with Randy and wanted to get revenge? Or might it have been a friend, someone Randy trusted, who for reasons unknown decided to steal away his life, leaving his family shattered and shrouded in grief? Surely someone out there knows, and it's about time they came forward, because unless they do or new evidence is found, the murder of Randy Church will remain open, unsolved, and very cold. If you're looking for more information about the murder of Randy Church, there are several newspapers and forums discussing his case. For this episode, the Billings Gazette and Montana Review were the most informative. If you have any information about the murder of Randy Church, please contact the Bozeman Police Department tip line at 406-582-2025. You can also submit information anonymously by sending an email to coldcasetips@bozeman.net. And as always, you can submit information directly to me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. Remember, a $10,000 reward for information remains available. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at traceevpod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. Now, I'd like to take a moment to thank our amazing Patreon producers, without whom Trace Evidence would not be possible. Andrew Guarino, Ann M. Bertram, Brutalist, Christine Greco, Crystal J., Danny Renee, Dierthy, Denise Dingsdale, Desiree Lauro, Deani Dyson, Jennifer Winkler, Justin Snyder, Kara Moreland, K.Y., Lars Jensen Fangel, Leslie B., Lisa Hobson, Melissa Breckeisen, Nick Mohar Schurz, Roberta Jansen, Ruth, Stacy Finnegan, and Tom Radford. Thank you all so much for your amazing support and for keeping Trace Evidence going forward. This concludes our coverage of the murder of Randy Church, a needless murder and a seemingly very solvable crime. Investigators have much of the puzzle, but they still need a few pieces, and they and the family believe someone out there has them in their possession. Unburden yourself and share what you know. I want to thank you again for listening, and I hope you'll join me next time for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.